This week I'm joined by Marina G. Ogden, who is an artist, writer and independent researcher on the work of Lev Shestov. In this episode we discuss Lev Shestov's philosophy alongside discussions on despair, hope, rationality and more. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermetics Podcast or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. So, Marina G. Ogden, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix Podcast.
Hello, James. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
That's okay. We are going to be discussing the work of Lev Shestov, the author of All Things Are Possible, Athens and Jerusalem, worked on Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, sort of, I think, understood as a pessimistic philosopher in the vein of Choron, Nietzsche, and other existentialist thinkers such as Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. But before we jump in with Shestov, just tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do.
Okay. Well, I was born and grew up in St. Petersburg, where I first studied art, Russian literature, philosophy, and culture. Initially, I trained as a classical oil painter, and then, after graduating from an art school, I became an independent artist and moved to the UK. For the last 20 years or so, along my artistic practice, I have been conducting research in relation to the questions that arise in my artwork and in my experience being an artist. My interest in the nature of creative activity directed me first to the philosophy of art and then towards religious philosophy. I undertook further postgraduate studies, and this culminated in writing both my master's and my PhD dissertations on the philosophy of Lev Shestov. For a number of years, I carried out an extensive research at the Lev Shestov archives at the Sorbonne in Paris, transcribing and translating Shestov's unpublished manuscripts, notes and drafts. In parallel, I have also carried out research at the library archives and special collections at the Institute of Psychoanalysis in London. Writing, publishing papers and presenting research findings at conferences eventually took over my artwork, and in the last 7 years I have been predominantly active as an academic. Next year, my book titled Lev Shestov's Angel of Death, Memory, Trauma and Rebirth will be published by Peter Lang.
Okay, so a very long history of working with Shestov.
Exactly.
So, before we do jump in entirely into his work, I have to ask you the Hermetics Question, which is you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. We'll include Shestov in the room and pick 3 more. So, who would you pick?
Yes, so I love this question. It's very creative, and then I did dwell on it for a while, and there was a little fight between the thinkers who wanted to be in that room. But the winners are Robin George Collingwood, English philosopher, Miguel de Unamuno, and Vyacheslav Ivanov. The 4 thinkers, including Shestov, were contemporaries. R.G. Collingwood was an English philosopher, historian, artist, and an archaeologist of Roman Britain. He wrote hundreds of papers and several books on Roman archaeology, while his earlier work was in theology and the philosophy of religion. He also wrote a very interesting book on the philosophy of art. Collingwood studied classics at Oxford and became interested in continental philosophy. Miguel de Unamuno was a Spanish philosopher, a professor of Greek language and literature at the University of Salamanca. Unamuno was an early existentialist. During his exile from Spain, Unamuno spent several years in France and in 1925 lived in Paris. Whether Shestov and Unamuno ever met in Paris, we don't know, but if they did meet, they would probably discuss such issues as the tensions between intellect and emotion, faith and reason, and the question of immortality. Coming from different cultural backgrounds, Unamuno, Collingwood, and Shestov share a common conviction that philosophy must be relevant to real life and that it should ask questions of real people. Vyacheslav Ivanov was a poet and the leading figure of the Russian symbolists. In the beginning of the 20th century, first in St. Petersburg and later in Moscow, writers, artists and poets would gather in Ivanov's apartment to discuss cultural and philosophical problems. Shestov, too, sometimes attended these gatherings. Although Vyacheslav Ivanov and Lev Shestov were friends, their worldviews were very different. Shestov acknowledged that he enjoyed listening to his charismatic friend's magnificent rave and called him Vyacheslav the Magnificent, Vyacheslava Magnifico. Like Shestov, Collingwood and Unamuno, Vyacheslav Ivanov was a man of a great learning and culture, at home in several languages, both living and dead. His poetry was much admired by Sir Cecil Maurice Borah, English classical scholar and an academic at Oxford. I think that Vyacheslav Ivanov and Collingwood would find a lot to talk about. I would love to listen to this four-man conversation, which I have no doubt will be conducted in a sincere and eloquent manner. Would I be allowed to bring one more late guest?
Of course, yeah.
Very quickly, if I had been allowed to bring one more late guest to join this lovely four men in the room, I would send John Middleton Murray. Nowadays a completely forgotten British thinker, Murray was a very prolific writer, poet, journalist and critic. Like Collingwood, Murray studied classics at Oxford. A friend of D.H. Lawrence, Murray had a wide range of interests, from literature to religious philosophy and artists' and writers' biographies. He also translated one of Shestov's books and wrote a preface to it. So he would he would love to meet Shestov. So let's hope it happens in that room.
Okay. Is there something personally you would like to sort of a conclusion or some knowledge that you think you personally would be able to draw from that conversation? Something that you've been sort of working with for a long time?
Well, I haven't thought about it, but I would like to, the cultural exchange that now happened in Shestov's lifetime, specifically between British thinkers and him, which he really tried, but it never happened. His books were translated into English, but when I did my research at the archives, I saw a note that he received, which was a rejection of further publication of his book in England due to a lack of interest from the audience. That really was difficult to see. So what really I would like to happen in that room is that communication, that cultural exchange between British philosophers and continental thought, which Shestov represented at the time. And also, of course, I don't know if Unamuno and Shestov ever met, but let's hope that they do meet in that room. Yes.
Okay. That brings me to one of the sort of the big questions. I mean, many of the thinkers that I talk about on this podcast are either extremely unknown to the point where there's only a handful of people working on them in the world, it seems, and they just aren't getting any traction, or they're thinkers who have finally got some traction and things are starting to get published. Shestov, however, is sort of in between. Quite a lot of people seem to know him and read him, but actually most of the people I've found who read him aren't academics and they're not academically inclined. They're outsiders, people who have come across him in a different way. So Shestov holds this sort of strange place where there seems to be some traction gaining on people being interested in his work because he appears in, within the work of numerous other philosophers. So the question really is why is he only just gaining this traction? Why is he forgotten in the English-speaking world, like you just mentioned?
Yes, I'm very grateful you invited me so I can finally bring some ideas forward, because this is possibly the first ever digital interview or talk that is dedicated to Shestov since his death. So it is true, James, Shestov's philosophy has been unjustly neglected in both Russia and the Western world in the 82 now years since his death. With the exception of a few British thinkers, D.H. Lawrence and John Middleton Murray among them, Shestov's philosophy has not been included in philosophical debates here in Britain, and his ideas, for the most part, have been ignored. However, thanks to one American scholar, Bernard Martin, who translated, edited, and wrote a number of articles about Shestov's work in the 1960s, some of Shestov's writings had become accessible for the English-speaking reader. I think that the complexity of Shestov's philosophical vision, and especially his conception of the religious faith, could be why his ideas have not reached wider audiences of readers here in Britain. It was Nikolai Berdyaev who pointed out that the central theme of Shestov's life was of a religious nature. Berdyaev noted that for Shestov, philosophy is not an academic speculation, but a matter of life and death. Shestov's intellectual searching, deeply rooted in Russian philosophy and literature of the 19th century, and his Jewish upbringing, is difficult to categorize. At first glance, Shestov's thinking doesn't seem to fit into any of the established intellectual traditions. The train of his thought is not easily explained. Philosopher Vasily Rozanov once said that Shestov is hopelessly clever. I think to be able to appreciate Shestov's way of philosophizing, an effort is required on behalf of the reader, who would benefit from a prior knowledge of Russian and European philosophy, literature, theology, and culture. At the same time, the form of Shestov's expression is not transparent. He often uses negation to convey his paradoxical thoughts. There is no intention to conform in Shestov's philosophy. His writings have been sometimes misunderstood, as he often critiques other thinkers. To some readers, his arguments may come across as repetitive. Someone recently even claimed that Shestov created his whole body of work around a single idea. As for me, Shestov is not a philosopher of one idea, unlike some other scholars suggested. I would warn against such simplistic reading of Lev Shestov. I would compare his writing to minimalist music or an orthodox chant. I refer here to the direction in contemporary music, sometimes called holy minimalism. In order to connect with Lev Shestov, I think we must make an effort to tune in with him on a deeper level of our being and be prepared to look beyond the frustration that we may experience as a reaction to what only appears as a repetitive motive. Although Shestov's thought cannot be put into a scheme, there is a hidden but subtle and steady progression in his narrative. Since his ideas are not present on the surface, one may have to read a lot of his work, perhaps everything that he has written, if you can, to be able to follow his train of thought.
Okay. That, the scholar that you mentioned who said that Shestov's work revolved around one idea, what was the single idea?
Well, he didn't specify. I guess, well, yes, I disclosed it's a he, but I won't tell you the name.
Okay. But you think that's reductive to say
it's the idea that he doesn't like, obviously.
Okay, I see.
That disagrees with,
Understood.
Yeah, I think if amongst your listeners anyone is a scholar of Shestov, they will know whom I am talking about. So let's leave it outside. Yeah.
But it does sort of lead me to something that's come up quite a few times on this podcast with regards to many of the thinkers who go sort of, who are perhaps not ignored, but just left by the side, such as Shestov, Choron, Demest. Okay, the list goes on. But one of the factors that I find which connects many of these thinkers is that they're pessimistic. They're irrational. That's a big one. Irrationality and pessimism is two things that, like the Western world, don't really want to confront. And do you think that this is in part one of the sort of the bigger reasons why Shestov has been ignored, is that he really is dealing with a philosophical irrationality and a very, very deep pessimism. And this isn't you with his philosophy, you're not able to sort of find a way around this or ignore this as you could with Nietzsche's pessimism or Choron's, for instance. Is this something you'd agree with? Do you think this is a factor in why he might have been, ignored a little bit?
Well, I partially agree with you. I'll explain. So Shestov indeed opposed the rationalistic tradition that dominated Western philosophy, and especially to the approach to existence as determined by reason, ethics, and natural necessity. His inquiry developed in opposition to Kant's theory of autonomous ethics and Hegel's famous statement that what is real is rational. However, Shestov credited Kant for creating the conditions for the emergence of the other kind of thinking. By contrast to Kant, Shestov dedicated his practice to the search for the other truth, which he describes as, I quote, a kind of living entity which does not stand uninterested and indifferent, waiting passively till we approach and take her, end of quote. Shestov argued that the truths of classical and speculative philosophy set unnecessary boundaries to human freedom and creativity. In his account, with the loss of freedom imposed by reason, there comes the loss of meaning and ultimately the loss of life. Rational judgment, which is based on evidence and logical argumentation, is a tyrant of the human soul, which by nature seeks to be free, says Shestov. He argues that we are all sleepwalkers in life until some inexplicable or life-threatening experience which activates our thinking about death awakens us from that sleep. Speculative philosophy avoids discussing the problems of life and death, as it hides away from the problem of human suffering. But for Shestov, human tears are much more powerful than any existing theories of knowledge. The cosmos, he says, was originally discovered in the human soul and only after that in the outer world. Although Shestov's thought deals with the irrational, as you noticed correctly, I would argue that it is far from pessimistic. On the contrary, as I propose in my book, his God-seeking, which is the driving force behind all his philosophical inquiry, is fundamentally life-affirming.
Okay. So you believe that in his form of pessimism there's a pessimism which is to sort of be worked through, and after this, beyond this pessimism, beyond this way of thinking about life, is something which actually affirms perhaps a reason or a purpose to exist?
Well, are you asking about the notion of despair? Because I would have to explain first what despair is in Shestov's philosophy. It's quite complex. So, can you repeat your question, please?
I think despair would probably be the best way to put it. So it's not exactly pessimism, as you say. It is this more complex philosophy of despair, in that you mentioned that actually it isn't entirely pessimistic, that there is some life-affirming characteristics of Shestov's philosophy. But what does one have to do to understand Shestov, to understand this life-affirming part of his philosophy? In what sense does this? In what sense can we go from this despair that you've mentioned to this affirmation of life?
So in Shestov's account, the despair that seizes us when we are confronted with the absurd reality of our existence leads us beyond good and evil to an act of faith. Born out of despair, faith is a renewed understanding of personal existence in the world, he says. Taking his individual experience as the starting point in his inquiry, Shestov proposes that despair may have a colossal power, and that one can find a guarantee of the future exactly in the horrors of life. Through inner transformation, our thought shapes a new vision of reality. This movement of faith stretches our thought beyond the rational and the logical into an unattainable and unthinkable dimension, the second dimension of thought, in Russian второе измерение мышления. A result of a fundamental transformation of one's convictions, faith opens a possibility for a new, free view of existence, which cannot be justified scientifically. This new dimension provides an opportunity to obtain the revealed, ultimate truth, which has nothing to do with the common truths of human reasoning and therefore is unknowable. In the second dimension of thought, words no longer have fixed meanings. Everything here must be recreated, begun all over again. In other words, Shestov arrives at a conclusion that human suffering can open an opportunity of a new life in freedom. An example of an accomplishment of such movement is Shestov's own intellectual journey, which begins from despair and leads to the revelation of the biblical message. As I talk in my book, the notion of rebirth is very important to Shestov, and it's not been discussed previously, and that's the life-affirming notion, which comes with the rebirth of man and the rebirth of life.
So would you like to go into those notions of the rebirth of man and the rebirth of life?
Well, maybe we will talk about what's more familiar to our listeners, which is the irrationality. Maybe that will help, because if I start talking about his faith straight away, that might be a little bit difficult.
Okay. We'll begin with the irrational. So why? In what sense is he understanding? I think firstly, to understand the irrational, I guess we have to ask: in what sense is Shestov understanding the rational?
Yes, so this is also a difficult question, James. So on the one hand, Shestov insists that philosophy should not prescribe or give us instructions how to live our lives. On the other hand, throughout his lifelong writing career, he struggled to find a meaning to the problem of human mortality, the meaning that could give an intelligible answer to his philosophical inquiry. Life and death were a mystery to him. He held that everything in the world is irrational. Shestov argued that we cannot see through the impenetrable veil of the mystery of the individual being unless we discover an unfathomable creative force that opens a possibility for a new, reformed vision. The disclosure of a different mode of consciousness in which the need to find reasonable explanations to everything around us is no longer essential, Shestov named a second dimension of thought. The second dimension of thought begins where all possibility that human reason can provide comes to an end. So one cannot develop a familiarity with the irrational experience as described by Shestov till it happens, because it happens suddenly. In a similar way, we cannot familiarize ourselves with a miracle, can we?
So there's always something which is unspeakable for Shestov?
Exactly. Well, everything that he likes to think of all the categories as open categories. So there's always a possibility in everything. So as there is a possibility in despair and someone's struggle, there is a possibility in death and in all the other things that what you call pessimistic. Therefore, do you understand now? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not sort of a stereotypical pessimism. It's one that you actually work from. You understand what it is you are. You understand first and foremost that you're being pessimistic. That you're looking at something in a certain way and then begin to persevere from that. So the possibility arises in the way that you approach something?
Exactly, Jane. So Vyacheslav Ivanov, whom I mentioned earlier, once said that a godless culture left a man a prisoner within his own self. But for Shestov, the despair that one faces is the price one pays for self-awareness. Like Kierkegaard, Shestov views human life and death as a struggle for an unattainable possibility. Struggle is an essential component of human existence, insists Shestov. According to him, our moral struggle, including our endless rational inquiry, will sooner or later bring us to emancipation, not only from moral valuations, but also from the ideal of freedom in relation to truth and the good, which Shestov doesn't think could be realized on Earth. The experience of possibility, therefore, becomes a means of articulating the paradox of existence. Shestov's view of the self is dynamic and fluid, subject to infinite possibilities. He praises Dostoevsky's Underground Man for his courageous descent into the realm of groundlessness, where time is out of joint. Groundlessness, according to Shestov, is the most enviable and the most incomprehensible privilege of the divine. In Shestov's worldview, finite concepts and truths are interchanged with the infinite paradigms, whereas the Underground Man substitutes the universal collective impersonal image. He infers that it is granted to man to have prescience of ultimate freedom. The created truth, in Russian сотворенная истина, therefore is a creative act of God. Faith is the possibility of the impossible and the experience of the revelation of truth. For Shestov, such faith is born out of the biblical promise, nothing will be impossible to you. For him, as it is for Freud, the path back from ignorance to reality is art. In fact, Shestov describes his philosophy as an art. The core idea of his philosophy, as I argue in my book, is the call for awakening and the spiritual transformation, in Russian превращение или перерождение, which could transgress one's existential experience beyond the borders defined by reason. And it is the key of his irrational conception of freedom.
So his idea of freedom, you mentioned Kierkegaard earlier. It does seem that his idea of freedom actually arises from that Kierkegaardian view of a leap of faith, in that there's always going to be something which you have to go beyond, which you absolutely do not know. So is it Shestov's understanding that we should work with this understanding of not understanding? Is that where we sort of find the irrational, in our inability to truly understand our situation?
Well, irrational is that what we can't explain logically and reasonably. But it doesn't mean that it's pessimistic, because that's already a moral judgment on that. Mm-hmm. So you are right. Shestov's idea of freedom is central to his philosophical vision. We have to say that. That's very important. I'm glad that you asked this question. For Shestov, as I have already mentioned, his idea of freedom is closely related to his notions of the created truth and salvation. Convinced that rational knowledge puts limitation to one's freedom, Shestov was searching for the other, as I said, different kind of truth, in which human freedom could be attainable. A new salvific truth of a sudden and mysterious transformation is a common thread in his intellectual struggle. He draws on the notion of the awakening of the soul in his reading of Plotinus. The awakened man is the man who has discovered the absurd nature of human existence. The sudden moment of awakening is the greatest dissonance and the most brutal rupture of every chord of our being. With the moment of awakening comes an opportunity to reevaluate one's values, in Nietzsche's words, and to regenerate one's convictions, in Dostoevsky's words, which leads to the ultimate discovery of an unlimited creative possibility. To be awoken to life, Shestov infers, we must begin the painful work of Sisyphus all over again. So pain, suffering is the beginning of awakening. In the transformation of thought, the possibility arises that shapes itself as a new reality. Shestov's irrational idea of freedom is conveyed in the notion of impossible possibility. For Shestov, freedom will return to man only when knowledge loses its power over our mind. Freedom comes not from knowledge, but from faith, for faith prepares us to meet death and puts an end to our fears. In the presence of and through faith, an individual human discovers a new dimension of thought. Faith for Shestov is freedom. Faith alone can liberate man for the power of the necessary truths that have controlled his consciousness since the time when Adam tasted the fruit of the forbidden tree, writes Shestov. His understanding of faith is that faith in revelation is above all impossibilities and inexorabilities. Shestov's conception of faith is not based on ethics. It is not proved by martyrdom or sacrifices. His faith exists beyond proofs. Divine reality for him exceeds our capacity of cognition. Shestov quotes Plotinus, "Only there, in the blending with God, is freedom. There is truth. There is the holiest aim of all endeavor." End of quote.
Okay, there's a lot packed into that.
Yes.
And I think the key thing to touch on is his idea of faith here, in that it's not beholden to evidence or to logic. And I think that's important. So this is quite a fairly sort of biographical question with respect to Shestov, but did he have a religious, should we say, a system, a following? Was he Christian or a certain denomination?
Well, that's a big question, James. So I won't talk about his religion, but I can talk about his faith. So as I mentioned, he was brought up in a Jewish family, and as a child, he was he read the Torah and the Talmud, and being one of the 7 children in the big family, they were taught. A teacher was hired to teach them Hebrew, so he was familiar with Jewish texts and even Kabbalistic writings. But when he went to university, he studied first in Moscow and then in Kiev. He also got interested in other religions, and all his life he was very open. So his religion, you can't really, just like in the case with Miguel de Unamuno, you can't pin it down, I'm afraid. He did develop his own very unusual concept of faith, which I was trying to introduce just a few minutes ago, just a little bit, because it is very complex, and there is not much conventional logic in it. And this concept of faith, I believe, is based on a mix of his reading of Luther, Martin Luther was very much influenced, his perception of faith, and also his Jewish upbringing and his interest in Christianity and other religions. Yes, but it is very, very important. His concept of faith really he explored it more towards the end of his life. So his early writings don't have much of that. You really have to read his later work, such as Athens and Jerusalem, and Kierkegaard and the existential philosophy, and of course Sola Fide, which was published posthumously.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Just to go back to the irrational and this unknowable sort of gap in our thinking. This, in my research, it comes up time and time again that this sort of leads us towards this idea in Shestov of sort of paradox, the paradox of the self in existence, in that once you sort of acknowledge this unknown, this place where you have to take this leap that you do not know something, you immediately are confronted with paradoxes and problems of thought in relation to your sort of equilibrium as a self. So what do you think for Shestov happens to the self and to man or woman in relation to this understanding?
Well, it all starts with despair for Shestov. So up until then, there is no really no point to talk about a man or a woman. And in his writings, he doesn't really specify. He uses the word in Russian "человек," which is difficult to translate. So I decided to use the phrase rather, individual human, because if I translated his человек as a man or individual, that's not exactly how, it's not very appropriate. So, for Shestov, the most acute thought arises only from despair. He insisted that only when there is no longer any lifeline left available to us to hold on to, that we're able to begin to think philosophically. This kind of tragedy takes place in the depth of the human soul, when we experience the most fearful loneliness, illness, or a life-threatening situation. The experience of utter hopelessness pushes us beyond the boundaries of what we have learned and known up until this moment in our lives. When despair takes over our mind and human reasoning is no longer at our service, our being is filled with unrest, says Shestov. We should not waste time on finding metaphysical explanations, but on the contrary, should try to stay awake. For the struggle within the confines of one's soul brings an opportunity to confront one's preconceived view of reality and fundamentally reconsider it. Precisely for Shestov, it is the opportunity to liberate oneself from the limitations of universal and dogmatic truths. This advance beyond accepted rational norms invokes an internal struggle at the level of human consciousness. It is our chance to accomplish an inner development, and according to Shestov, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Tolstoy, Luther, and Plato all went through such transformation. Following this line of thought, Shestov argues that philosophy is not a pure thinking, but some kind of inner doing, inner regeneration, or second birth.
There is really, for Shestov, there isn't this actual initial self. It's all about what happens after despair. So perhaps it's a silly question, but how does he understand man prior to despair? Is that just a useless assessment for Shestov?
Well, the man, before he faces a life-threatening situation or an experience of despair that pushes him to the edge, really is a sleeping man for Shestov, is this ignorant man who is succumbed to his reasoning and his preconceived ideas of reality. And so his mind is asleep at that point.
And so it's only after one sort of has a realization of their inability to reason freedom and, find a rational means towards freedom that they actually truly become free. So it's only in this sort of paradox of how you understand your place in the world and how you reason yourself to be in the world that's the only place you can find freedom. Is sort of the place you almost don't want to find it.
So, well, you might have heard before that Shestov's philosophy is all about a person, himself to start with. His experiences obviously are very important for his philosophy. So, but he doesn't prescribe. So he doesn't want you to experience that despair. But we all know that there is a point in our lives when we do experience it. So he just goes straight into that point, because for him that's how actually his philosophy of tragedy began, when he had a life-changing crisis. He was 29, and it was in 1895. And he kept a secret all his life what exactly happened. It's actually very interesting. But recently, diaries of the lady that he fell in love with were published in Russian. They've never been translated into English. They were published just a few years ago, and I read them. And according to her name was Varvara Malachiva-Mirovich. She was a house teacher to one of Shestov's sister's children. And so the two of them fell in love, and apparently, according to her, his personal crisis is related to that situation that occurred between them, because their love has never been realized in a relationship. And Varvara actually rejected. Shestov proposed to her, and she rejected his proposal. And in despair, Shestov then proposed to her sister, Anastasia, which caused even more stir in the family, because his family were against him marrying a non-Jewish woman whatsoever. So they rejected that marriage, and poor Nastya fell ill, and So the sister, not Varvara, the sister fell mentally ill and spent the rest of her life in a psychiatric clinic, which is very awful, of course, tragic. And Shestov also fell ill. He had a nervous breakdown and went abroad for treatment. It was after that incident that he actually started writing his philosophy of tragedy. But he just calls it in his diaries. He calls it the time when when time fell out of joint, using Shakespeare's words. That was the time when it happened. Yeah, so his philosophy has a direct relation to his own experiences, but it also, I believe, it's worth learning from his experiences. We always learn from others, and so not directly that he prescribes and gives advice and creates any rules or theories, because there are none in his philosophy. That's why it's so difficult to talk about it. But there is a very interesting information, to say the least, for us as humans. Yep.
So what do you think happens to philosophizing in this position that Shestov has sort of put forward, this position where as a philosopher, as a thinker, as someone who is dealing and interpreting life, they are in a place which is a complete paradox, which is, Shestov talks about losing all conviction, losing the security of reason and rationality. What sort of happens to philosophy once you are philosophizing from that position?
Well, as I said, you probably don't know what happens until you experience it, just like with the miracle example earlier. But we can speculate, sure, what would happen in the absence of all conviction and knowledge obtained by rational thought. For our desire for security and comfort is very strong indeed. Whether such a possibility is attainable in our earthly, godless lives today, I don't know. But Shestov is optimistic. In his view, faith emerges from a personal experience which is precisely motivated by our desire for security and comfort. He draws parallels with faith and madness. According to him, a religious man is able to oppose his madness to the wisdom of the world. Madness, the way Shestov understands it, can never receive recognition from reason. Not only does Shestov differentiate the roles of philosophy and science, but by associating religious faith with madness, he refutes all rational ideas that may comply with accepted intellectual norms. In his effort to designate the opposition between faith and wisdom, he takes the side of madness. He states that if there is God, and all men are the children of God, we should be afraid of nothing and spare nothing. In his account, it is this kind of madness Nietzsche talks about when he uncovers the other side of good and evil. It is the state of mind of Dostoevsky's underground man when he discovers the utter absurdity of his condition, and it is what Shakespeare tells us about when Hamlet's time comes out of joint. However, Shestov emphasizes that the full force of sorrow and despair should not be directed towards a preparation of new doctrines and ideals. Philosophy must not provide universal rules of guidance about how to live one's life. For the mystery of faith will always be a mystery, and all rational attempts to find ways to justify it and convert people to it result in nothing. Life, for Shestov, is and always will be the miracle of miracles.
So that leads me to sort of a really big, probably and quite confusing question for most people from the Western world are going to come to any philosophy from that point of reason and rationality and trying to figure things out, logically, I guess you would say. What then is the purpose of philosophy for Shestov? If it leads up to this inevitability where you're within this, this paradoxical moment, what is the purpose for Shestov?
Yes, that's also a key question, James. I can see that, you are struggling along with me, which is good. That's very good. I do not wish to all our audience to struggle as much as we do at this point, but still, philosophy, Shestov argues, is the teaching of truths which are binding on none. Similarly to his friend and colleague Edmund Husserl, Shestov saw Western culture in a state of deep crisis. Philosophy, he says, should not consist in unraveling the gordian knots of existence. In other words, philosophy must not inspire to simplify our view of reality by providing reasonable explanations. If there are contradictions in life, philosophy must live from these contradictions. For Shestov, what is most important lies beyond the limits of the understandable and the explainable. Hence, the goal of philosophy for him is to free the human mind from the limitations of universal, dogmatic, and all intellectually constraining truths. He states that the purpose of his philosophy is to teach us to live our lives without certainty and to help us confront our existential fear and anxiety in the face of inevitable death. Philosophy for him is not born out of wonder as it was held by the Greeks, but from an inescapable and profound despair. Consequently, he sees that the role of his philosophy as a wandering through human souls, and the greater philosophers for him are wanderers through souls. In the spirit of Nietzsche, who stated that every great philosophy is at core a personal confession, Shestov takes up the ancient dispute between faith and reason and treats it with much intensity and depth. Contrary to the established norms in the classical tradition, he describes his philosophy as an art which aims at breaking the logical continuity of argument. In the year before his death, it should be said though, Shestov expressed deep doubt whether faith and truth could ever stand alone from the overpowering domination of reason.
Do you think there's anything key that we've missed? Of course, we've missed a lot, but we've touched on sort of the overarching reasons as to why. Faith, despair, the pessimism, this irrationality. Is there anything you feel that's key with Shestov that we've missed?
There's quite a lot I wanted to say.
Okay. That's fine.
But I will have to. How much time do we have, by the way? Because
that's up to you.
I will just use this quote because it kind of summarizes everything else that could be said. I already mentioned John Middleton Murray, whom I quite not admire, but I'm very interested in his writings. Unfortunately, he's completely forgotten here in Britain, but he's written a lot. And in one of his books called The Conquest of Death, which was published in 1951 here in Britain, he stated, I quote, that this book is an assertion of the reality of revelation. And if the reader does not experience the revelation, then what the author tries to say about it will be nothing more than nonsense to the reader, end of quote. Well, I think that these words can be applied to Shestov's philosophy as well.
Where would you advise people to begin with Shestov?
Yes, well, I guess I'm following Shestov. I don't like to advise. Actually, for me, it happened from I first came across Shestov's book, Apotheos Bespochennosti, which is translated into English as All Things Are Possible. And that's quite, I think that's easy to read. Well, if it's easy, is even possible to use in the description of Shestov's philosophy, but it's probably the best to start with because it's got quite sharp and short ideas put together. I think about 160 short aphorisms or essays, and it's sort of it's like his palette. It's got the colors of everything else, of the future picture in the making. So that was the book I began from.
Okay.
And also this book was published, by the way, in St. Petersburg. And in 1905, it was later translated and in English and came out in 1920 in London with the preface written by D.H. Lawrence. Quite an interesting preface he wrote for this book. Unfortunately, they did translate it differently, so it's not Apotheosis of Groundlessness, but All Things Are Possible. And I read this book many years ago when I did my undergraduate studies in St. Petersburg. And Shestov was not mentioned, not even once mentioned in my philosophy course at the time. That was obviously a long time ago when Shestov and Florensky were not mentioned in academic books and university programs. So that was, inspired me later on to study more and read more by Shestov.
I see. Is there anything else, anything more you'd like to add, or some notes that you might have jotted down that you'd like to add in?
Yes, I wanted to say that there's one question. Sorry, just a moment. Yeah. So. I think what we should have mentioned that's very important, that at the turn of the centuries in St. Petersburg, well, in Russia, St. Petersburg I mentioned because obviously I was born there, but also it's where philosophers acted and published their books. And when they gathered together at Ivanov's apartment, discussed all the problems. So it's important to remember that at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, Russian religious philosophers were all looking for a revitalized creative power that could offer a new perception of the world. Closely allied with the words of art and literature, the Russian thinkers became concerned with the ideas of religious rebirth, the defeat of death and immortality. The spiritual upheaval began in St. Petersburg and is often referred to as a religious awakening and a revival of a new religious consciousness. Shestov was not an active participant in this movement, but as Prince Svetoslav-Mirsky wrote, Shestov and Rozanov were the most original and, from the literary point of view, the most significant of the religious philosophers or seekers after God. So this is important to remember. So we don't want poor Shestov to hang out in space without any, strings attached to him.
No, that's an interesting question. I mean, who are Shestov's heirs who we might be able to... I understand that Emil Choron was a great follower of Shestov, but other than that, who were those who we might be able to read today who were directly influenced by Shestov?
Well, in terms of the influence, I would just single out this short list. Dostoevsky, Shakespeare, Nietzsche, Plotinus, Luther, and Kierkegaard. Obviously, there were many more. And as his friend Berdyaev noted, Shestov's philosophy also had affinity with Duns Scotus, and the influence of William James's writings was very important for the development of his convictions. And his mature philosophy, as we already mentioned, was his reading of the Bible was very important for his mature thought, and as well as his very highly original interpretations of Kierkegaard. But in the year before his death, he was actually reading books by Indian authors and European authors on Indian philosophy. And according to his daughter, on the day of his death, a book on Indian philosophy and a Bible were on his bedside table.
And who were those? Who are those? Perhaps there's even some alive today. Who are the bigger thinkers who are actually influenced by Shestov's work?
Yes, so there's been quite an effort's been done to contextualize Shestov as a precursor of existential movement. And, well, we know that he immigrated to France. He was already 54 when he left Russia, by the way, so it was very difficult for him he could never I think, well, he continued to write in Russian anyway. That's why his manuscripts are still kept at the Sorbonne's archives, and a lot of them are untranslated. But I use them. I translated quite a lot for my book. So when he came to France, he was literally unknown. And but within a few years, a few of his writings were translated into French and published, first articles and then books. And he made quite a big impression on French philosophers. For example, as you mentioned, Cioran, who called him the greatest historian of philosophy, and Cioran observed that Shestov's work is well reasoned and controlled, but his thought has nothing to do with Anglo-Saxon philosophy. Gabriel Marcel also admitted that at some point he was very much influenced by Shestov's ideas. Camus mentions him in his Myth of Sisyphus and talks about Shestov's discovery of the fundamental absurdity of all existence. And of course, Russian emigre philosophers like Nikolai Berdyaev, Sergei Bulgakov, Nikolai Losky, and others, also writer Ivan Bunin, they were all taken by Shestov's, by the originality of his thought, and mention him in his writings. But also, interestingly, I'm still exploring this, Miguel de Unamuno. I don't know if they did meet, like I said, I want to find out. But there is a connection with Miguel de Unamuno somewhere between Shestov's writing and his thought. So I will look further into this. And well, in England, D.H. Lawrence and Chesterton, Isaiah Berlin, and David Gascoigne and John Middleton Murray were the few things that appreciated Shestov's philosophy. But also more recently, Gilles Deleuze highlighted the significance of Shestov's contribution to European philosophy. And Deleuze and Guattari, whom you often mention, I know, in your podcasts, commented on the striking discontinuity that Shestov's paradoxical thought exemplifies in the European tradition. They put Shestov in line of private thinkers, such as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And of course, we should not forget wonderful Benjamin Fontaine, Shestov's only disciple, who unfortunately died in 1944 while he was murdered by Gestapo and in the camps. But he wrote, he documented their conversations in the book, which was published later on after Benjamin Fontaine's death, called Conversations with Lev Shestov. So maybe actually, as a starting point, maybe this book would be also of interest for those who have no idea what Shestov is about. Yeah, I would recommend maybe this one, against my rule of recommendations. Yeah.
So it's quite a big and diverse, array of influence there, but he doesn't seem to ever really be seen as like the primary. It's strange that the Myth of Sisyphus by Camus is read, by tens of thousands. It's one of the most well-known and accessible books of philosophy there, but it's strange. It's just strange to me that Shestov is one of these thinkers that's never sort of risen to the top. He's never picked out and tried to understand.
Yes, it is a shame. Actually, I'm not totally certain, but according to my research, which I've been doing quite for many years, Shestov mentions, the myth of Sisyphus in his writings dating as early 1920s. And we know that Camus read Shestov, and he does, talk about it in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. So, again, I don't know, but it's a possibility that the title of the book could be inspired by Shestov, actually. But, of course, Shestov didn't get credit for anything, unfortunately. He left all his ideas very open, and that's the problem.
Yeah. I see. He'd probably do even worse today, then.
Oh, yes. Well, I hope that some people will find his ideas interesting. I think he appeals to a creative mind mainly, because if you have all those constructs of reason in your head, that you will really struggle with Shestov. That's going to be a torture. But a creative mind, when you are able to have associations spreading out in different directions across borders and constraints and areas of your imagination, Shestov is actually quite inspiring to read.
Okay.
Liberating, I would say. Yeah. Liberating experience, yes.
Okay. That seems like a good place to finish up.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, Marina Ogden, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you for your interest, your patience, and your ability to embrace the struggle that we have shared during this interview. Thank you.
Thank you.